Hi everyone, I'm Jess from Minerva, here today to share with you a sew-along tutorial for the Simplicity pattern 8289 to help you make this special occasion dress. There will be some tips and tricks along the way, as well as the step-by-step guide itself. You can save this video to refer back to at a later time, as well as find all the products and materials I've mentioned linked below for your convenience. Before you start, I recommend watching this video all the way through just to familiarise yourself with the pattern. Before we start, let's take a closer look at the packet. As you can see, the pattern comes with 3 standard variations. The basis for each one is a full-length skirt with a yoke style shoulder covering and a weighted fabric base layer under the overlays. Version A has a lace bodice overlay and additional tulle drapes to the floor-length skirt overlay. Version B, which is the one I'll be focusing on today, has a separate full-length sheer overlay layer. And finally, version C is a knee-length variation with a lace yoke. There's nothing stopping you mixing and matching the various elements to each of the variations as they have the same basic construction. Turning the packet over, you'll find the suggested fabric list, which I'll talk about more shortly, and then the materials list for each of the pattern variations as well as the yardage for each of the fabric, as well as any additional materials you'll need such as zips and trims. A quick note on sizing. When picking the size you want to make, don't go off your high street shop size, as these vary from country to country and company to company. Instead, measure yourself at the start of each project and go off those measurements to find your size. I'll be making a size 6. So let's talk about the suggested fabric for this project, as there are several layers involved. For the main base layer, I will be using this ivory crepe back satin. Other suitable materials include linen types, silks and taffeta. Take this into account as this will be the layer that dictates the amount of movement the skirt will have, and also how it will pair with your chosen overlay fabric. Thread outside has a great feature that will allow you to add the matching thread into your basket to match your chosen fabric to save you the time for having to hunt for it yourself. I am using this matching cream Gutermann polyester thread. For my overlay, I am using this pink floral chiffon fabric. Other recommended fabrics include chiffons, georgettes, lace or organza. Remember, you may need a different thread to match your overlay if the colour used for your base layer doesn't suit. There will be visible stitching on the overlay. The whole dress is fully lined, so for that I'm using this ivory anti-static lining fabric. I'd always recommend using anti-static lining as it's going to be against your skin, so it feels nicer and obviously reduces static build-up from the dress layers. We'll also be needing interfacing. I am using this super stretch iron-on fusible. We'll be using this to stiffen up the fabric for the bodice. You will also need 2 buttons. These will close the upper back of the dress at the neck. You need roughly 1/2 inch size buttons that will match your chosen overlay fabric. For the main closure, you will want a 12-inch invisible zip that matches your chosen overlay. And lastly, some elastic cord. This may end up being slightly visible, so you want to take this into account when selecting your colour. I am using this Preme Elastic white cord. With all your materials together, it's time to get started. When you open the packet, you'll find the thin pattern sheets and the instructions. Let's look at these first. The first page comes with an illustrated key to understand the different icons used throughout the instructions and a cutting layout guide. These layouts are a suggestion. If you are pattern matching with a particular fabric, just remember to take the grain line of each of the pattern pieces into consideration when positioning them. And then you also have the instructions themselves as well. Moving on to the pattern sheets themselves, you can iron these on a low heat to get the creases out, which makes them a little bit easier to cut. Find the pieces you need for your pattern variation and size and cut them out. Each pattern piece tells you what it's for and how many of which fabric you'll need to cut out. Using the cutting layout guide from the instructions, cut out all the fabric pieces you'll need for the version you're making. Once you have all your pieces cut out, it's then time to put them together. For all the variations, the first stage is to apply interfacing to pieces 1, 2, 3 and 4, which make up the bodice. Some application processes vary, but generally fusible interfacing is applied like this. Match up the fusible with the sticky bobbly side to the wrong side of the fabric, using a scrap piece of cotton as a barrier to prevent the fusible sticking to your iron plate. Iron over the fabric, making sure you only do small sections at a time. Test the corners to make sure there is no peel back. If the 2 layers aren't fusing together, you may need to turn the temperature up on your iron. For version A and B, we are now going to apply the overlay to the pieces. To attach these, pin the wrong side of the overlay to the right side of the bodice fabric and then machine baste them together with long stitches 1 centimeter away from the raw edge. I wanted to show both versions of this for you. You can also overlock the edges to baste the overlay fabric to the bodice. Just be sure you do not cut away any of the seam allowance at this point. The reason we baste the 2 layers of fabric together before we join the bodice sections together is to prevent the overlay fabric from slipping in between the 2 layers. For all versions, join the bodice together with 1 in the middle, then 2, 3 and 4 respectively, moving out from the left and right. Once sewn, press all the seams open. With the front done, it's time to move to the back. The next stage is the yoke and neckband. For version B and C, apply overlay to piece 12, which is the yoke front and back lining. For this section, the instructions call for you to use organza fabric as a lining here. As I don't like the feel of organza against my skin, I tried using the normal lining fabric that I'll be using to line the rest of the dress, and it worked perfectly well, so it's a suitable alternative if you feel the same way. Finish the back and armhole edges of piece 12 with a narrow hem. To do this, press under the edge by 6 mm, stitch close to the pressed edge, and then turn under and press again by 3 mm, and then finally stitching through all the layers to secure the hem. Then reinforce the seam line 1 cm on either side of the small dot before cutting a notch, taking care not to cut through the stitching. Next, you'll need to attach the lace trim to the back and armhole edges. I am not adding this detail as I am easily irritated by trims like this, but if you are adding it, line the scalloped edge up at the start of the piece's raw edge and sew. Now we need to prepare the neckband. To do this, apply overlay and your interfacing to piece 5. Cut 2 pieces of your elastic cord 4.5 centimeters long. Fold each in half, bringing the ends together to make a loop. On the outside, pin both the loops to the left side of the neckband at the small dot markers and baste them into place. With right sides together, pin the notched edge of the neckband to the yoke piece. The top will overhang by about 1 centimeter. Sew a 1 centimeter seam from the notched edge and press under. Clip the notches if needed. The neckband, cut 2 pieces of the lining material using the number 5 as a guideline again. And sew a row of stitches 1 centimeter in along the long side. Then press the excess up before we go to attach it to the neckband. With right sides together, pin the lining to the neckband and sew through all the layers. Turn the lining to the inside and press. Then understitch the neckband lining as far as possible. To secure the lining, slip stitch the edge to the main yoke piece. Then we need to attach the yoke to the bodice. Match up the dots to line the pieces and then baste the 2 locations into place. You'll want to make sure here that the seam between the neckband and the yoke matches up the seam between piece 1 and 2 of the bodice, so it will look like a continuous line when it's turned the correct way out. Set aside the bodice for the moment as we start work on the skirt. Start with making the back seam by joining up 2 number 8 pieces. Go from the hem and stop 5 centimeters below the notch marker. Clip a notch at the top of the seam, be careful not to cut through your stitching. Then attach the front panel, which is number 7, at the side seams. Make your overlay and lining layer the same way. When you have all 3 made, assemble them so you have the wrong sides of the main skirt and lining together, and then the wrong sides of the overlay to the right side of the main skirt. This way you'll have no visible seams from the outside or inside. Baste all the layers together along the top of the waistline and down the open sections of the back seam where we will be putting the zip. If you are making variation A, you'll need to prepare the 6 drapes of your overlay fabric and attach them to the waistline, matching up the dots as reference points before attaching the bodice. When you're ready, with right sides together, pin the bodice to the skirt before stitching them together. Then press the seam up towards the bodice. I also overlocked this seam as well, just to give the seam a little bit more strength as the skirt layer is quite heavy. And now it's time to move on to the zip. To do this, we will need an invisible zipper foot. The instructions say to line the zipper up with the end of the tabs in line with the top of the bodice. However, I marked a point 2 mm below the stopper on both sides of the teeth and use this to line the zip up at the top. This way you'll ensure that the zipper runs right to the top when the dress is done up. I'll start with sewing down the left side of the zipper, making sure to do a few lines of backstitch at the top and bottom to secure it. You can hand baste the zipper into position before you sew with the machine. When going through the machine, make sure you do it in small sections at a time, taking care to roll the teeth out of the way to ensure the line of stitches is as close to them as possible without going through them. This will make the zip as invisible as possible from the outside. Then, to line up the right side, flip the zip around like this. And line up the free side and sew down that. With the zipper in, make sure you close it all the way up to make sure that both sides of the waistband line up and that it meets at the top as well. Finish the zip, turn everything inside out and pin all the layers together so that the zip is on the right hand side. With an adjustable zipper foot, start roughly 1 centimeter above the cut notch and then sew a line down to meet the seam allowance of the centre back seam. This will create a neat finish from the outside and make a stopper for the zip. Next, we need to make the lining layer for the bodice, which we do exactly the same way we did for the bodice itself. Before attaching the lining, press the edge under by 1.5 centimeters. Then attach the lining to the bodice with right sides together. Stitch only the upper edge first. Reinforce the stitches at the small dot. Trim any notches you need into the seam allowance at the curves and the inner corner of the centre front. To sew the lining at the sides, we're going to need an adjustable zipper foot, so 1.3 centimeters in from the seam allowance. This will make a line very close to the teeth of your zip. Next, we need to understitch as far around the lining as possible and then press thoroughly. Slip stitch the pressed edge of the bodice to the waist seam. Make sure you're only sewing through the lining layer. On the outside of the neckband, sew your 2 buttons to line up with the plastic loops that we sewed earlier. Before hemming, the instructions say to let the dress hang overnight to let the seams settle. When you come to hem, especially if you're making a dress for a particular occasion, make sure you try the dress with shoes on before deciding how much you need to change the length by so that it doesn't end up being too short. You may need a second person to help you measure how much you want to turn the hem up by. Finish each of the layers with a narrow hem. With your lining layer, finish the hem so it is roughly 1.5 centimeters shorter than the overlay. This will make sure that it is not visible when the skirt moves as you walk. There you have your finished dress. It was actually quite simple to put together and I did have a lot of fun making it. There's just a couple of things I wanted to highlight for you so you didn't run into the same difficulties that I did. Firstly, the fabric that I chose for my overlay turned out to be impossible to pattern match, so instead what I did was go for matching block colour sections together, which worked quite well for the bodice. However, I didn't take into account the same when doing the skirt, so something to bear in mind for yourself as to how the 2 pieces will join together if you're working with a similar overlay fabric. Also, the only construction difficulty I had was when I was attaching the yoke piece to the front of the bodice, the point of where I would quite like to do this again, just so I can practice the technique, as I didn't get the lines to match up perfectly and it did require a lot of pressing to get the finished look. I hope this video has helped you with putting this project together and given you some more confidence with your own sewing. If you have any questions about anything in this video, comment them below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And we love seeing what you come up with, so if you've had a go at this pattern or indeed anything else, why not create an account with Minerva to share your creations with our wonderful sewing community. Thank you for watching and be sure to come back regularly for more sewing inspiration.